After consulting with Secretary of Defense Cheney, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Powell, and our coalition partners, I am pleased to announce that at midnight tonight, Eastern Standard Time, exactly 100 hours since ground operations commenced and 6 weeks since the start of Operation Desert Storm, all United States and coalition forces will suspend offensive combat operations.
The Desert Storm was a time of destruction and improvement. Military offensives against Iraq began on January 16th through 17th, 1991, with an insane wave of air campaigns from the U.S. throughout the war. It was called Operation Desert Storm and destroyed it just destroyed Iraq in general. They attacked communication networks, government buildings, weapon plants, oil refineries, roads, and anything in their way.
My unit was the best of the best, of course. It was a success. I was deployed from Germany to the Gulf around 1990. I rose in rank after being retired as a colonel for about 11 years, after being all over Korea, Afghanistan, and the Pentagon. I can't just let those efforts be in vain. I made the operation what it's known for with my team.
It all started due to diplomacy. This refers to representatives of different groups discussing such issues as conflict, trade, and security. It's all in hopes of maintaining peaceful relationships between nations, groups, or individuals. Diplomacy was displayed through the U.S. when they spoke on the militant issues with Iraq, and how they believed they had weapons of mass destruction. The U.S. thought Iraq was a threat to international peace. Most countries refused to support military action against this, but the U.S. pursued it for world safety. During the Gulf War, oil played a significant role. Saddam Hussein, Iraq's president during 1979 to 2003, promised a decisive victory against the forces of Western imperialism. But he will be remembered for bringing his country to the brink of complete ruin, and yet, in the process, being an acclaimed Muslim hero. Kuwait oil fields were set on fire by Saddam Hussein's retreating forces at the end of the conflict in February 1991. On the streets of Iraq's larger cities, the mass unemployed people were becoming disruptive too. Launching attacks on Israel, inflicting little damage, earned him immense credit for widening the conflict with the Arabs. Yet, he was applauded for standing, or trying, to stand up to all of America alone.
The impact of the Gulf War on the land resources of Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq was expected to be disastrous. The utility of landmines on the modern battlefield had come into question in recent years, largely because of their potential for causing unintended casualties and affecting U.S. forces' maneuverability. According to U.S. service records, of the 1,364 total U.S. casualties in the Gulf War, 81, or 6%, were killed or injured by landmines.
He's got 3.5 million of these that he bought. He also makes them in-house. 5 January, he put in 60 clicks of minefields by hand. He hasn't used any of his Toad stuff. He hasn't used any of his sophisticated plastic stuff. He's been walking it out, digging it in. 3 to 5 pounds of pressure, it blows your foot off. The defector came across the border a couple nights ago. He brought the CO's Jeep with him. In the back was a bunch of boxes that said PMN. It's a very effective mine. That much. Your foot's missing. This is to take it all the way off about to the knee. He buries these in. You can't see them. He puts these in. He also puts mines like this in. Every one of his soldiers carries a mine like this in his rucksack. It's called a POM-Z. It's a directional frag. This little thing here, he puts 2 pieces of fish wire on it. Goes out about 20 feet on either side.
These landmines were an example of how land use was affected. The Gulf crisis itself had an impact on soil, vegetation, wildlife, agriculture, and even water. It became so bad that political policies had to be in place. For example, for air pollution, the Clean Air Act addressed emissions of hazardous air pollutants. Before 1990, there were only a few standards developed.
25% of the total forces and were thought to be the most vulnerable to heavy casualties. Even in war, there was still institutional racism that shows a clear form of inequality among U.S. soldiers due to their race. Because of the color of their skin, they put them in vulnerable places, with President Bush backing this by voting the Civil Rights Act.
I was put right where I was guaranteed to never come back. We were subjected to heavy casualties. Meanwhile, all my white buddies were in paradise. There was no help out there. And when I did come back, nobody cared.
The attack on Kuwait, resulting from military activities during and after the Gulf War of 1991, produced alterations to the surface sediment and morphed features that led to environmental degradation. These were lands soldiers fought on, and it became the battlegrounds to all NATO allies and the Middle Eastern countries of Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Egypt to oppose Iraqi aggression. These maps show some destruction and routes that the battles created. From the perspective of foreign migrant communities, living during the war was much more of a disaster for Arabs than for Asians. Arab migrant populations were dramatically affected by the Gulf crisis. In contrast, the Asian migrant community was largely concentrated in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and remained relatively less affected by the crisis.
(661, 678, 686, and 687). 61 passed, imposing a ban on all trade with Iraq and called on the United Nations members to protect the assets of Kuwait. This was later endorsed. But 78 authorized the U.S. to use force to compel Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait, but gave Iraq a 45-day grace period to help liberate Kuwait. 86 set forth conditions for a ceasefire, where Iraq was obligated to accept its provisions, which included reparation payments for war damages, as well as returns of stolen land from Kuwait. The United States continued to put pressure on Iraq through the United Nations throughout the years. Eventually, the Security Council Resolution 687 was made to inspect Iraq's suspected chemical and biological weapon capabilities, causing Iraq to get stripped of chemical weapons and missiles and its nuclear research capabilities.